Hello, good evening, and welcome to In Focus. With the controversies surrounding the Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement and what appears to be general opposition to Sri Lanka opening up to the world economy, we thought it would be insightful for our viewers today to have a discussion with Professor Ricardo Hausmann, who's visiting Sri Lanka. He's the director of the Center for Development at Harvard University. Professor Hausmann, thank you very much for taking time off to speak to us on First in Focus. You delivered a lecture, a public lecture in Colombo this week, where you were talking about skills for development and the importance of knowledge transfer and how opening up the economy brings a transfer of knowledge, expands society's capacity to develop. Throughout the world, though, we're seeing a trend, a sort of populist trend, that is somewhat anti-trade. If, over the years, opening up to trade has indeed brought about greater knowledge transfer and, greater capacity for development, why is there continuing opposition to it?
Well, the question of, the benefits of trade are slightly different than the questions that really concern me. What really concerns me about Sri Lanka is that the export basket of Sri Lanka has changed very little over the last 25 years. The country was exporting tea, cinnamon, coconuts, rubber. Then it got into garments, and garments became relatively big at a time when it also became relatively big in other countries. But those other countries like Thailand, Vietnam, China, after they got into garments, 10-15 years later they got into electronics. Then 10-15 years later they got into machinery, automobiles, and so on. And those transformations never happened in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka got stuck in garments.
Were these countries able to get into or to diversify their export basket because they opened up, or was it other factors?
Well, they opened up, but the channels through which things happened, for example, India transformed enormously, but it's a relatively closed economy. In many, it's at least as closed, if not more closed than Sri Lanka. But the problem with diversification is that you need to produce things you were not producing before. But in order to produce things, you have to know how to produce them. But if you haven't produced them before, how it is that you know how to produce them? So how do you start producing the things that you don't know how to produce? So that's the problem, the chicken and egg problem that slows down diversification. And to overcome that, you need some kind of infection into the system. You have to bring in the know-how of how to do things you were not doing before. And this is not just the know-how of one individual who knows. It's the capacity to organize teams of people with complementary skills that can run the new kind of production. And there are several mechanisms through which that happens. One is foreign direct investment. Another one is migration. And another one is diaspora networks. So if you compare yourselves to Vietnam, you've got on average for the last 15 years 1 percentage point of GDP in foreign direct investment. Vietnam got 6%. Singapore got over 15%. So there's a huge difference in the amount of attraction of foreign companies that could bring in their technologies, their know-how, insert themselves with other, bring maybe a couple of expats, send people home to train for training and so on. Those things didn't happen. Second is the issue of migration. Sri Lanka likes to compare itself with Singapore. In Singapore, 46% of the population is foreign-born. In Sri Lanka, 0.02% of the population is foreign-born. There is one foreigner for every 500 people in Sri Lanka, while there's almost one foreigner for every 2 people in Singapore.
Is it fair to make that comparison, though? Because Singapore is essentially a city-state, whereas Sri Lanka is a a much larger and fairly densely populated country as well.
I think it's not a question of fairness. It's a question of how diverse is the people that you are bringing together. So, for example, in Silicon Valley, 57% of the people who work in the IT sector are foreign-born. 57%. And it's not that the other 43% are Californians. Only 12% are Californians. The rest come from other parts of the U.S. And California is a state that has twice the population of Sri Lanka. So the reason why Silicon Valley became what it is, it's not because Californians are very talented and they have a fantastic educational system. It's just that it's a place that is able to attract talent. So that attraction of talent didn't happen much in Sri Lanka. But to the extent that it happened just a little bit, you see it in the nature of the successful firms in Sri Lanka. The successful firms in Sri Lanka, whether it's this solid tire firm that was created by this Belgian family, or this electric, Orange Electric firm that came from an Australian investment and that now diversified into artificial intelligence through some international contacts of the CEO. All of these reflect this international connection of how the business idea got into the country, how those firms got into existence, how that technology came in. So that's the second migration. And by the way, you have one of the most closed migration policies in the world. You're one of the very few countries that doesn't have a path to permanent residency. You don't have a path to citizenship. There are very few countries in that class. And you have very restricted immigration policies. You have some authorizations for foreign companies that are regulated under the Bureau of Investments. But for regular Sri Lankan companies, you have very little. So if a company, for example, I run the Center for International Development at Harvard. My whole IT team, I have 5 people that develop software for our tools. Of those 5 people, 1 is American. The leader is Canadian, 2 are Turkish, 1 is Vietnamese. I cannot create a team to do the things I need to do if I'm going to rely only on the talent born of 300 million people that were born in the U.S. And you only have 20 million people that were born here. So if you try to create in Sri Lanka a first-rate group of people who can run, a sophisticated organization, you have to empower those firms with the capacity to bring in talent.
On that note, we're going for a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about opening up and inequality. Is there a correlation? Welcome back to Infocus. We're in conversation with Professor Ricardo Hausmann, Director of the Center for Development at Harvard University. We're talking about opening up Sri Lanka's economy and the challenges and the opportunities that come with it. In your lecture last week, you highlighted the example of Panama. Now in Panama, we see that a quarter of the population lives in poverty, in some form of poverty. Sri Lanka too has problems with inequality and poverty. And opponents to opening up say that when you open up, when you invite in more, you're exacerbating the problems of poverty and inequality. Do you believe in the argument that the approach of opening up the country as a tool for development leads to more pronounced inequality?
I think that sources of inequality that really should worry us is inequality in productivity. Because a lot of the discussion on inequality is how you split the pie. But the truth of the matter is that in developing countries, different parts of the country are producing pies of radically different sizes. There are some parts of the economy that are operating at extremely low productivities. And if people stay in those activities, they will be poor. There is no way in which, given the productivity of their activities, they could prosper. So a lot of the problem of getting rid of poverty is to move people from low productivity activities to higher productivity activities. One of the channels that has been used enormously in Asia, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, is the move from agriculture to manufacturing, from traditional agriculture to more modern forms of manufacturing. Manufacturing requires big markets. And you know, if you're a country like India, maybe you have 1 billion people to sell to in India. But if you're a country like Sri Lanka, you need a market to sell your products to. So the way to get people out of agriculture into more productive activities is to develop companies that can access big markets. Whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's in services like, say, tourism. Well, if you're going to move people into tourism, you need many people from abroad to be coming in.
But for a from a government policymaker's standpoint, don't you think that removing people from agriculture and into other sectors like manufacturing compromises a country's food security, for example? Definitely not.
Definitely not. You know, the U.S. in 1910 had 50% of the labor force working in agriculture. Today it has something like 2% of people working in agriculture, and that doesn't mean that they have less food. They have about 4 times as much food as they had before. It's just that agriculture doesn't need that many people, and the problem in Sri Lanka is that people are working with very little land. If you took some of the people out of the land, the people remaining in agriculture would remain with the same amount of land, but they would have more land per capita, so output per capita could go up, their incomes could go up. For example, today, the population of Korea is almost 4 times the population that Korea had in 1960. But today, Korea has half the rural population it had in 1960. And agricultural production has gone up enormously. So you just don't need as many people to produce food, because you can increase agricultural productivities, but with fewer people in the same amount of land. And then you use those people to produce, you know, cell phones, cars, and so many other things that Korea is known for.
Complexity in your export, in the products that you're exporting to other countries, is also a very important subject to consider when diversifying your exports. Because ideally, you wouldn't want to be exporting just raw materials. You want value addition to be happening here. What are the challenges facing countries like Sri Lanka when achieving that kind of value addition?
Well, see, the problem of the complexity of a product is how much technology does it really embody. And the more technology it embodies, the higher the productivity in its production. So what concerns me about Sri Lanka is that you have a part of the economy that cannot afford to pay high wages. For example, garments cannot afford to pay high wages. Tapping rubber trees cannot afford to pay high wages. Plucking coconut cannot afford to pay high wages. And as a consequence, you have a situation where these industries complain that they cannot attract workers, because a worker would rather go to a city and drive a 3-wheeler than to stay in rural areas and earn the amount of money that those activities can afford. So what we want is to move production to these more complex activities that can afford to pay higher wages.
But does this necessarily generate higher wages? Because we see, for example, you take Sri Lanka, and I'll give you from personal experience an example. We see that when starting out, for example, you take a graduate trainee at a blue chip conglomerate in Sri Lanka, makes less money as a monthly wage than a 3-wheeler driver. You would have seen a lot of tuk-tuks around the city. So that sort of argument that being involved in more complex activity leads to better pay and higher wages, is this just a paradox?
No, it's not a paradox, because the problem in the case of the 3-wheeler, you're comparing a person's return to his capital, which is the 3-wheeler, plus his labor, against the other person who's just his labor. But for example, the average person working in the IT sector in Sri Lanka earns 50% more than an equivalently educated worker in other activities. So there are these activities can afford to pay higher wages. The way wages have been moving up, say in Vietnam and China and Thailand, is because they started producing garments, they moved from garments to electronics that could afford higher wages, and then from electronics they moved to cars that could afford higher wages. And business process outsourcing, IT, etc., the export of professional services, all of these activities can afford to pay higher wages because you are no longer, say, competing with Cambodia or with Ethiopia. You're now competing with Italy or with Germany, or which have wages that are multiple higher. So if you more or less can approximate their productivity, you can beat the hell out of them in the market.
So it's like a football league. You graduated from the championship to the premiership.
Poor countries make poor country kind of goods, and rich countries make completely different kinds of goods. It's not that rich countries make poor country goods and they can pay them a lot more money. You have to transform what you produce, and you have to transform the way you produce in order to be able to afford higher wages. I think that the goal of development is that people live better lives at higher levels of income.
On that note, we're going for another break. When we come back, we'll talk about how big of a factor is power in ensuring technology transfers between developed and developing countries. Welcome back to In Focus. We are talking with Professor Ricardo Hausmann, Director of the Center for Development at Harvard University, regarding opening up and the challenges and opportunities that come with it. Now, when we're talking about technology transfers that come when a country opens up, that comes through foreign direct investment or through bilateral trade agreements, let's take the example of China. China opened up to have investments in public transportation, and now China is building high-speed railway networks in other parts of the world. China had significantly more bargaining power than a country like Sri Lanka, for example. How important of a factor is power when it comes to issues like trade negotiations and ensuring that the technology transfer happens?
Well, I think that power is typically very asymmetric in trade negotiations, but the benefits are also completely asymmetric. Because, say, if Sri Lanka negotiates a free trade agreement with India, maybe India is more powerful, but India is opening up a market of 1.3 billion people, and you're opening up a market of 20 million people. So if you get to an agreement, you get much more market access than they do, right? The payoff to you is much bigger.
But does that access necessarily translate into dividends? Because India might be opening up a market of 1.3 billion people to Sri Lanka, but does Sri Lanka have anything to sell that those 1.3 billion people want?
I don't think that the strategy of development is centered around trade policy. Trade policy is just one little instrument to make sure that if you develop capacity, you have somewhere to sell it. You just have seen in Sri Lanka, you get a bumper crop, and if you don't have the capacity to sell it abroad, it's a bad news for the farmers because the price collapses and they have to give the stuff away. So once you have the capacity to sell, it's very important that you have a place to sell it. But it's very important also that you focus on the capacity to sell. Now, your question implied that through these power differences, there's differences in the capacity to absorb technology. But technology is more like a virus that you communicate sometimes without necessarily wanting to. A lot of what has happened in technological diffusion, for example, the way Bangladesh got into garments is because a Korean company went to Bangladesh and hired 126 Bangladeshi workers, sent them to Korea for a 6-month training program, and sent them back to Bangladesh to operate the firm. Within 10 years, 56 of those workers had left the firm to create their own firms. And the technology of Korea ended up spreading throughout Bangladesh in the heads of the Bangladeshis that were trained by the Koreans. So technology has very awkward mechanisms to which it spreads. Another very important way through which it spreads is diaspora networks. You cannot tell the story of Bangalore and Hyderabad without telling the story of the non-resident Indians that had migrated to California and had learned, say, the business in California, and then set up shop back in Bangalore and Hyderabad. And so Sri Lanka has an important diaspora. I have noticed there are some links of things that happen here that happen because of the existence of that diaspora. But countries extract differential value depending on how deep is and how connected is the relationship between the country and its diaspora. India has a policy for non-resident Indians to attract them, to keep them connected, and so on. In Armenia, Kosovo, Albania have ministers of diaspora. In Sri Lanka, you've had a policy that pretty much disregarded the diaspora. If a Sri Lankan changed nationality because the nationality where he's hosted does not, the country where he's hosted does not accept double nationality, if he renounces Sri Lankan nationality, he can no longer live in the country. There's no path to permanent residency. There's no path to citizenship. And these people are disconnected. 2 years ago, the government allowed... This
is something that India has done quite successfully with their NRI and Overseas Citizen of India programs.
Absolutely. They focused on that because they understand the value of their diaspora. So there's a lot of things that Sri Lanka needs to learn that the Sri Lankan diaspora already knows, and that if you could access that knowledge, if you could access those technologies, you could do a lot of good.
So it's not simply about just opening up to other countries around the world, it's also opening up to your people who are scattered around the world.
Absolutely. It's opening up to opportunities. The opportunities of 7 billion people are much bigger than the opportunities in 20 million people. And countries have grown. Look at how did Japan grow. Japan was a medieval country until the Meiji Restoration in the 1870s. And when they opened up to find out what are the best ideas are out there, the best institutions out there, the best technologies out there, to bring them in. So no country has grown by its own wits. The secret of humanity is its capacity to imitate what others have discovered, others have done, and to adopt it and adapt it to their conditions.
There are also concerns that are raised when it comes to opening up and going into more advancement, that countries need to have proper regulatory frameworks that are already in place. This is most often raised when it comes to issues concerning the environment and being sustainable. When opening up, how do you ensure that you are also at the same time protecting your environment or conserving your environment, and also ensuring that that this will bring about some form of sustainable growth?
I think that people who argue that before you do X, you need to do Y, really don't want to do X. In the world today, say international companies have more concern about their reputation, about being environmental degraders, than do many local producers. And they sort of like have to answer to a higher standard. A garment company cannot afford to buy garments made by child labor. There's a whole scandal right now because IT firms, technology firms are using cobalt that uses child labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So they feel forced to impose on themselves standards that are typically higher than the local standards. I think that obviously regulation has to be adequate, but this idea that one thing has to come before the other, or as if you were going to fix one thing before you know what needs fixing. You don't know what are the challenges and the problems of an automotive industry, or the challenges and the problems of the industries that you don't host. So how are you going to do a regulation for activities that don't exist if you don't know what those activities are and what problems they generate? So I think that, you know, regulation has to accompany the process of production, but it cannot be a precondition for you to start moving.
Professor Hausmann, thank you very much for taking time off your very busy schedule and for talking to us. It's been an enlightening discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.